Ask any human being if they have ever felt different from themselves at different times in their lives, and the answer will invariably be yes. Ask if there were times when everything seemed easier, when enthusiasm was a constant presence rather than a daily achievement, when life had a texture of openness and possibility that made even difficulties bearable and to some extent exhilarating. And also ask if there were other times when this quality had simply disappeared, when the same being that once flowed now resisted, when the forces that were previously available seemed to have retreated to some inaccessible place, leaving a kind of inner aridity that the effort of will could not undo. Almost every human being will recognize these alternations. But very few will know what they are, where they come from, why they happen as regularly as they do, and, most important of all, what to do about them. Rudolf Steiner dedicated a significant part of his life and spiritual work to answering exactly these questions. And what he revealed about what he called the real cycle of the soul radically and irreversibly transformed the way in which whoever understood it could relate to the alternations of their own inner existence. The first and perhaps most important thing that Steiner asserted about the cycle of the soul was a denial. The cycle was not a pathology. At a time when psychiatry was beginning to consolidate itself as a discipline and when the medicalization of inner life was taking its first steps, Steiner pointed in the opposite direction and said that the alternations of soul life, periods of expansion and periods of contraction, moments of abundance of strength and moments of apparent scarcity, were not signs that something had gone wrong in the psychological or biological mechanism of the human being. They were expressions of a rhythm that was as fundamental to the nature of the soul as the rhythm of breathing was fundamental to the nature of the physical body. Suppressing this rhythm, trying to fix the soul in a permanent state of expansion and available energy, was as absurd and as counterproductive as trying to suppress the exhalation phase of breathing and keep the lungs perpetually full. The result would not be perpetual health, it would be suffocation. For Steiner, the soul breathed. Not metaphorically, but in a way that had its own precise spiritual mechanics, its own laws, its own rhythms that could be described and understood as rigorously as the biological rhythms of the physical organism. The soul expanded towards the external world, leaving itself to find, perceive, learn, love, create. And then it contracted again, turned inward, assimilated what it had found, transformed into inner substance what it had gathered in the expansion. This contraction was not a failure of the previous expansion. It was its necessary complement, the phase without which the following expansion would be emptier, more superficial, less capable of creating that genuine contact with reality that was the goal of all authentic spiritual life. Exhaling made the next inspiration possible. The withdrawal of the soul made the next flowering possible, and a richer flowering than that which had preceded the withdrawal. But Steiner went far beyond this image of breathing, which captured the general structure of the phenomenon, but left unanswered the more specific questions about what exactly happened in each phase of the cycle, and why the cycle had the regularity it did. To answer these questions with the precision he considered necessary, he needed to draw on his understanding of the fourfold nature of the human being, the constitution of physical, etheric, astral, and self bodies that he had described in detail in his works of spiritual science. Because the soul cycle was not a phenomenon that occurred only in one of the dimensions of human existence. It was a phenomenon that involved the totality of these dimensions and their specific interrelations, and that could only be understood correctly when one realized how each of them participated in the cycle in ways that were both distinct and complementary. The etheric body, which Steiner also called the vital body, or body of formative forces, was the vehicle of the forces that kept the organism alive, and that supported the processes of growth and regeneration. But it was also the vehicle of memory, the repository of everything that had been experienced and assimilated throughout life, the substrate on which inner life was inscribed in a way that remained available for future development. And it was the etheric body that, in its relationship with the astral body, largely determined the quality of the different phases of the cycle. When the astral body, which was the vehicle of emotions, impulses, and feeling life, was in harmony with the etheric forces, there was a quality of faith, flow, of availability, of energy that was expressed in the flowering phases. When there was tension between the astral forces and the etheric forces, when the astral body had been overwhelmed by experiences that the etheric forces had not yet been able to assimilate and transform, there was the withdrawal, the tiredness, the feeling that the forces were unavailable that characterized the phases of withdrawal. Steiner described with particular care the role that sleep played in this dynamic. During sleep, the self and the astral body partially withdrew from the physical and etheric organism. This withdrawal was not just physiological, the relaxation of muscles, the reduction of metabolic functions to the minimum necessary to maintain life. It was spiritual. It was the return of two of the four principles of the human constitution to their spiritual sources, to those regions of the spiritual world from which the forces they employed during waking came. And during this return, the etheric body, freed from the intense presence of the astral body that during the day worked on it in ways that both stimulated and exhausted it, could perform its most fundamental function: the renewal of vital forces, the regeneration of memories and habits inscribed in its substance, the preparation of the soil for the new day of development that would follow upon awakening. What Steiner revealed about this process of nocturnal renewal was something that conventional medicine and psychology of his time simply did not have the tools to perceive: the fact that the quality of the renewal that occurred during sleep depended, in a much more direct way than previously imagined, on the inner quality of the human being who entered sleep. Not just the quality of the events of the day before, although those events had their importance, but the quality cultivated over many days, many weeks, many months of inner life. A human being who had systematically cultivated clear thinking, feelings oriented towards the good, a disciplined will towards what he considered true and valuable, this human being entered sleep with a quality of astral body that found, in the spiritual regions he traversed during sleep, a receptivity and an abundance of renewable forces that would be inaccessible to a human being with less developed inner qualities. The practical consequence of this was that the soul cycle was not just something that happened to a human being as a result of external forces over which he had no control. It was something that human beings participated in creating through their own inner qualities. The flowering phases were not simply cosmic good fortune that befell certain human beings at certain times. They were the fruit harvested from an inner work that had been carried out over a long time and that had created the conditions so that the return to the spiritual world during sleep would bring back forces that were especially abundant and especially qualified for development. And the recall phases were not simply bad luck or malfunctions. They were a sign that the forces of the etheric body needed a period of less external demand to renew themselves more deeply, and that this period, if honored with the quality of attention and inner work that it deserved, would prepare the ground for a richer flowering than that which had preceded withdrawal. In Steiner, there was a description of what happened in the human soul during the phases of withdrawal that went far beyond the simple recognition that these phases were necessary. It was a description of the specific spiritual work that took place in these periods, and that was impossible to do during periods of expansion and flourishing. During the phases of contraction, when the forces that sustained vibrant, enthusiastic contact with the outside world seemed withdrawn, there was a very specific type of inner deepening that became possible precisely because of this withdrawal. It was as if the retreat of the forces that supported the surface of life created space for the deeper layers of existence to become perceptible, so that what the noise and activity of flowering had obscured could emerge into consciousness with a clarity that expansion simply did not make possible. Steiner identified this process as one of the most important mechanisms of spiritual development over time. It was not possible to grow continuously just through expansion, just through active contact with the world and the accumulation of new experiences. A period of retreat, of processing, of transformation, of what had been experienced into a substance that could be assimilated in a way that permanently modified the internal qualities of the human being was necessary. Without this period of spiritual digestion, the accumulated experience remains CIA as unassimilated material that weighed on the being without truly nourishing it, that increased the quantity of experiences without proportionally increasing the depth of wisdom and capacity for love that were the true fruits of genuine spiritual development. The karmic perspective that was central to Steiner's entire worldview added to the cycle of the soul a temporal dimension that transcended the limits of a single lifetime. The cycle was not just the pattern that repeated itself within an incarnation. It was the pattern that structured the very alternation between incarnations, the rhythmic movement between the state of incarnated life on earth, with all its density and spiritual opacity, and the state of life in the spiritual world between incarnations, with the clarity and freedom of spiritual forces that the physical state did not allow. Each incarnated life was, from this perspective, a flowering phase of the longer cycle, a period of exposure to the physical world that created certain possibilities for experience and development that the spiritual state between incarnations did not provide. And the state between incarnations was the withdrawal phase of the same cycle, the period in which the spiritual forces that had been used in incarnation were renewed and prepared for the next plunge into physical existence. Steiner described in detail what happened to the human soul after death, and this description was directly relevant to understanding the longer cycle. Soon after the separation between the spiritual dimensions and the physical organism that death represented, the soul underwent a panoramic review of the entire life that had just ended. This review was not sequential, a remembering of past events one after another. It was a simultaneous perception of the whole of life, an experience in which the totality of what had been experienced presented itself to consciousness at once, as a complete picture in which every detail was present at the same time. And in this simultaneous perception, The soul had access to something that during incarnated life had been systematically inaccessible, the perspective of other people, what others had felt and experienced as a result of the actions, words, and even thoughts of the being that had inhabited that body. This expanded perception, which Steiner called kamaloka in the vocabulary he shared with the theosophical tradition, but which he described in a specific and original way, was simultaneously the most painful and the most necessary phase of the after-death cycle. Painful because it clearly exposed that incarnated consciousness could never withstand the full extent of the impact that one's own actions had had on other beings. Necessary because it was precisely this complete perception of the impact caused that created the karmic intentions that would direct development in the next incarnation, that established the field of learning and resolution that the next life would need to contain so that the development of the soul could continue in a coherent and progressive manner. The next phase, which Steiner called Devachan, or the spiritual world proper, was the maximum flowering of the interincarnational cycle. It was here that the soul, freed from the densities of the astral body that had dissolved during Kamaloka, encountered spiritual qualities in their purest and most powerful form. The music he had experienced on earth was here revealed in its primary spiritual nature, richer and more meaningful than any physical expression could capture. The moral principles that he had aspired to during his incarnated life were experienced here as concrete and palpable realities, not as abstractions that needed to be applied with effort to everyday behavior. Mathematics, geometry, the principles that organized the cosmos in its deepest structures were perceived here with an immediacy that the incarnated consciousness could only glimpse in moments of greater intellectual clarity. And it was in this state of maximum spiritual flourishing that the soul prepared the seeds of the next incarnation. The qualities he had developed, the talents he had cultivated, the moral dispositions he had forged through repeated choices over previous lives, all of these were transformed by the spiritual work of Devachan into gifts that would appear in the next life as seemingly innate abilities. The musician who revealed himself as a child, the mathematician whose talent seemed incomprehensible in the face of any effort that could explain it by learning alone, the human being whose empathy and whose moral sense seemed to be of another order than what the environment could have produced, all of these were visible expressions of the seeds prepared during the period of spiritual flowering between incarnations, the fruits of an invisible but absolutely real work. The descent back into incarnation was the beginning of a new phase of and withdrawal into the greater cycle, the dive back into the density of physical existence that limited and opaqued the faculties that had flourished in the spiritual, but that created exactly the specific conditions that the development of the soul at that point in its trajectory needed. Steiner described how, throughout the process of incarnation, which extended from the moment of conception to birth and beyond, the different dimensions of the human constitution were progressively established within the physical organism that was being formed, each bringing with it the history of its development in previous incarnations and the karmic intentions that had been established during the interincarnational spiritual state. The initial flowering of a new life, with all the openness and receptivity that characterized childhood, was the expression of this arrival of spiritual qualities in a new body. The small child, who Steiner described as still being much more spiritual than physical in his fundamental orientation, who had not yet built the barriers between the inner and outer world that the years of incarnation progressively created, expressed in this openness the riches he had brought from the spiritual world. And the process of growth and development throughout the years of childhood and youth was the process of gradual densification, of increasing rootedness in the physical world, which at the same time created the conditions for the specific experiences that incarnation had been designed to provide. Steiner described with extraordinary precision the different rhythms of the cycle within a single incarnation, especially what he called the 7-year cycle. Each period of approximately 7 years marked, according to him, a significant transformation in the constitution of the human being, a change in the relationships between the different principles of his nature that created new capabilities and new vulnerabilities. The first septenary, from birth to approximately 7 years of age, was the period in which the etheric forces, which had been occupied with the construction of the physical organism during fetal development in the first years of life, were progressively freed to be used in thought and memory. The change of teeth, which marked the end of this first period, was the physical sign that the formative forces had completed their most immediate work on the organism and could now be used in higher functions. The second septenary, from the age of 7 to 14, was the period of development of the astral body, the vehicle of emotional and sensory life. Puberty, which marked the end of this period, was the physical expression of the emancipation of the astral body, of its progressive liberation from the tutelage of the etheric forces that had contained it during childhood. And it was this emancipation that produced the emotional intensity characteristic of adolescence, the volatility, the passionate search for meaning and identity that so often disconcerted adults who tried to accompany young people at this stage. For Steiner, this turbulence was not a problem to be solved, but a process to be followed with understanding and respect, a specific flowering of astral life that prepared the ground for the development of the following period. The third septenary, from the ages of 14 to 21, culminated in what Steiner called the birth of the self, the progressive emergence of the deepest spiritual individuality as an active and conscious force in the life of the human being. This process, which the Western spiritual tradition had often associated with initiation rituals that marked the transition from youth to adulthood, was for Steiner the beginning of a new and more conscious participation of the human being in his own development, the point from which the cycle of the soul began to be potentially traversed with a level of consciousness and responsibility that was before that moment was simply not possible. But the cycle did not end with the establishment of the self as a conscious force in the life of the human being. It continued throughout adult existence, with phases of greater and lesser flowering that did not necessarily follow the regular rhythm of septenaries, but that responded to a complex combination of factors, including the planetary cycles that Steiner described as having an influence on human development, the karmic opportunities and challenges that the destiny of a specific life presented at certain times, and the inner qualities that the human being himself had developed or neglected and that created predispositions for certain experiences of expansion or contraction. Mature age brought with it, from Steiner's perspective, a specific cycle of flowering that was qualitatively different from the florins of youth. If the florins of youth were characterized by intensity, by unrestricted openness, due to the abundance of physical and astral forces that had not yet been disciplined by experience, the florins of maturity had a different quality. They were less intense on the surface but deeper in substance, less exuberant but more rooted, less brilliant but warmer. And the falls that occurred in maturity, when they occurred, also had a different depth than the falls of youth. They were less dramatic on the surface, but more demanding in substance, asking for inner work that youth simply did not yet have the tools to carry out. Old age, which contemporary culture often saw simply as decline and loss, was for Steiner one of the most spiritually rich phases of the soul's cycle within an incarnation. It was the period in which the forces that had sustained vibrant contact with the outside world progressively withdrew, creating exactly the conditions for the deeper and more spiritual dimensions of existence to become more perceptible. The elderly person, who had developed sufficient inner life throughout his life, found in old age not an impoverishment but a deepening, a growing familiarity with dimensions of existence that the years of intense activity in adulthood had obscured. And death, which completed the cycle of incarnation, was for Steiner not the end of a process, but the transition to the next phase of the longer cycle, the withdrawal that would precede the next flowering in the form of a new incarnation. There is something that Steiner revealed about the way in which human beings could relate to the cycle of the soul that was especially valuable and especially difficult to implement in practice. The idea that the relationship with the cycle was in itself something that could be developed and refined over time, and that the development of this relationship was one of the most concrete and most immediate ways of collaborating with one's own spiritual development. The person who had learned to recognize where they were in the cycle at a given moment, who had developed the sensitivity necessary to perceive the signs that heralded the transition from one phase to another, who had cultivated the wisdom to adjust their demands and their expectations of themselves according to the phase they were living in, that person was not just living more comfortably within the cycle. He was developing a form of spiritual self-awareness that was itself a step in developing the faculties that the spiritual path Steiner described required. This spiritual self-awareness included the ability to perceive the difference between phases of withdrawal that were genuinely necessary and fruitful and those that had turned into stagnation, into a fixation on the pole of contraction that prevented the cycle from completing its natural movement back to expansion. Steiner recognized that there were situations in which human beings were trapped in a phase of decline in a way that was not simply the natural duration of this phase, but the result of an inner resistance that needed to be worked on in a specific way so that the cycle could begin again. In these cases, the spiritual practice that he described in works such as How to Acquire Knowledge of the Superior Worlds offered concrete resources to unblock what had become obstructed, to dissolve the knots that the astral body had formed and that impeded the natural flow of vital forces. The exercises that Steiner recommended for working consciously with the soul cycle were consistently practices for developing specific inner qualities, not techniques for directly manipulating moods. Meditative concentration, which developed the ability to maintain firm and clear thoughts regardless of variations in one's emotional state, created a pole of inner stability that allowed one to go through the phases of withdrawal without getting lost in them. The cultivation of equanimity, which he described not as indifference, but as a quality of inner calm that was not shaken by the fluctuations of life, created the basis on which both phases of expansion and contraction could be experienced with a presence that made them fruitful. and the development of genuine gratitude, not as a voluntarily adopted posture, but as a real perception of the richness that existence contained, even in the apparently most impoverished phases, created in the astral body a quality of openness that made the transitions between the phases of the cycle smoother and richer in learning. What Steiner revealed about the cycle of the soul was, in its deepest dimension, a revelation about the nature of time and the way in which human beings related to it. Contemporary culture had a relationship to time that was fundamentally linear and unidirectional. Time advanced from a past that had been to a future that would be, and the present was just the transition point between the two, rarely inhabited with the fullness it deserved because attention was always focused either on what had been or on what would be. The cycle of the soul revealed a relationship with time that was fundamentally different, cyclical, in which what had been and what would be met in the present of each phase of the cycle in ways that made the present much richer and more multidimensional than linearity allowed us to perceive. The flowering of the present was the fruit of past reflections and the seed of future reflections. The gathering of the present was the processing of past guilders and the preparation of future guilders. And the rebirth that followed each fall was not simply a return to the state before the withdrawal, as if the cycle were a circular repetition of the same. It was the arrival at a new point, at a state that incorporated within itself the transformation that withdrawal had made possible, and that was therefore qualitatively different, slightly deeper, slightly more capable of love and understanding than the state that had preceded the fall. The cycle was a spiral, not a circle. Each complete turn left the human being at a point that, although superficially similar to the starting point of the previous turn, was in fact a different point, situated at a slightly higher level of the spiral that constituted the trajectory of spiritual development over time. The phrase that inspires this text, "the soul flourishes, falls, is reborn and calls it living," gains in this perspective a depth that goes far beyond any romanticism about life. It's not saying that life is beautiful despite the falls. He's saying that falls are a constitutive part of what makes life what it is, that without them the flowering would be less profound, the rebirth less rich, the development less genuine. It is saying that calling this process living is both more and less than what it seems. Less, because the process continues beyond any individual life, through incarnations and through the cosmic cycles in which individual incarnations are embedded. And more, because living, truly understood, is not simply existing within a cycle that happens. It is to consciously participate in a process of development that has a direction, that has a purpose, and that uses each flourishing, each fall, and each rebirth to build, with the patience that only eternity can sustain, what the human being is not yet but is, through all this becoming. Steiner also addressed the question of how the cycle of the soul was expressed in the lives of human communities and not just individuals. Communities, peoples, cultures went through their own cycles of flourishing and falling that had their own spiritual mechanics and that could not be reduced to the sum of the individual cycles of the human beings that made them up. What Steiner called archons, or group souls, were spiritual entities that presided over collective development and guided its cycles in ways that purely materialistic history could not perceive. The great cultural epochs that Steiner described in his study of human history in the light of spiritual science, from ancient Indian to Egyptian to Greco-Roman to our post-medieval times, were expressions of cycles of flourishing and falling on a civilizational scale. Each great culture had flourished by reaching the point of maximum expression of a specific spiritual quality that was its particular contribution to the development of humanity as a whole, and then had entered its phase of decline and fall when that quality had been developed to the maximum that historical and spiritual configuration could provide. And from the fall of each great culture had emerged the germ of the next, the rebirth that brought with it, transformed and deepened, the qualities that the preceding culture had developed, plus the new possibilities that the following cycle made available. The European Renaissance was for Steiner a paradigmatic example of how the cycle worked on a historical scale. The long medieval winter had prepared the ground for that flowering, having developed through centuries of apparent stagnation a capacity for inner life that made the explosive creativity of the Renaissance possible, and the cycle had not stopped. It had continued through the following centuries with its own phases of expansion and contraction, its own extraordinary florins and its declines that prepared florins yet to come. The present epoch, which Steiner saw as an especially critical period in the long cycle of humanity, was a time when the forces of downfall and crisis that characterized the end of a great cultural epoch were operating with unprecedented intensity, creating the conditions for a renewed, equally unprecedented rise that would only be possible if humanity as a whole developed the spiritual qualities necessary to cross the threshold that this cycle created. Steiner did not view this moment with pessimism. He saw it with the seriousness that the magnitude of the transition demanded, and with hope based not on naive optimism, but on the spiritual law that guaranteed that no genuine fall could be the end, that each crisis of development contained within itself the seeds of the development that it made necessary. The relationship between the cycle of the individual soul and the collective cycle of cultural epochs was one of Steiner's most original and most challenging perspectives, because it required the individual to perceive himself not just as an isolated unit going through his own cycle, but as a participant in a much larger cycle, within which his own cycle had a place and a meaning that went beyond his personal trajectory. The flourishing of a specific human being at a given historical moment was not just the result of his inner work and individual karmic development. It was also the expression of the specific possibilities that that moment in the collective cycle made available. And the fall of a specific human being at another time was not just the result of his personal limitations. It was also an expression of the specific difficulties that that point in the collective cycle imposed on everyone who lived at that time. This perspective had fundamental practical implications. Each human being who, in a moment of collective crisis, developed within himself the spiritual qualities that the situation required, was contributing in a real and concrete way to the collective flourishing that was to come. The qualities developed by individual beings at a given historical moment fed the collective spiritual field, making these qualities more accessible to others who had not yet developed them. Individual spiritual development was never just individual. It was also always a contribution to collective development. The specific role of art in the cycle of the soul was something that Steiner developed with deep attention, convinced that art was one of the most direct paths of contact between human beings and the spiritual dimensions of reality. For him, genuine aesthetic experience was one of the most immediate forms of experience of the cycle of the soul in its essential dynamics, a true work of art created in the beholder both expansion and contraction, openness towards what the work revealed and withdrawal towards what it awakened within the person who encountered it. Music, which Steiner considered the most directly spiritual art, was the clearest example of this dynamic. A symphony coursed through the listener through phases of expansion and contraction, of increasing intensity and stillness, of blossoming themes and recollection, in pauses that were as important as the notes. The experience of the listener who truly surrendered to music taught, without words and without concepts, the correct relationship with the alternations of the soul's own cycle. That's why Steiner placed musical education at the center of his pedagogy. It was a way of developing in children, before concepts were possible, sensitivity to the cycle that would be the foundation of all subsequent spiritual development. The eurythmy that Steiner had created made music and language visible in bodily gestures, creating an experience in which the entire body participated in the cycle that art articulated. Therapeutic eurythmy, which used these movements for healing purposes, was based on the understanding that certain qualities of movement corresponded to certain qualities of spiritual forces, creating conditions for etheric and astral forces to rebalance themselves after periods of imbalance. Steiner saw in sacred architecture another expression of the cycle of the soul articulated in stone and space. The entrance to a temple expressed the transition between the flourishing of external life and spiritual retreat. The elevated and bright interior space expressed the flourishing that seclusion made possible, and the exit back to the world expressed the enriched rebirth. The Goetheanum that Steiner personally designed was the most complete expression of this architectural understanding, a building in which every curve and shape expressed aspects of the spiritual world that the soul's cycle traversed. The study of plants, developed in dialogue with Goethe and elaborated on his spiritual science, offered another perspective on the cycle of the soul, especially concrete. The plant, which completed its annual cycle of germination, growth, flowering, fruiting, and withdrawal into the seed in a visible and indisputable way, was a mirror of the cycle of the human soul. And there was a specific correspondence between the different parts of the plant and the different dimensions of the human constitution that made it. This mirror was particularly revealing and useful as an instrument of self-understanding. The root, with its penetration into the soil, with its downward movement towards darkness and density, with its absorption of mineral substances from the earth, corresponded to the neurosensory pole of the human being, the head, the nervous system, the pole that was closest to the mineral world and which was the vehicle of clear consciousness but also of coldness and the tendency to hardening. The flower, with its luminous opening towards the sun, with its perfume that expanded in the air, with its color that was the most complete expression of the etheric life of the plant, in contact with the heat and light of the cosmos, corresponded to the metabolic and membranous pole of the human being, to the heat of love and will, to the flowering of astral forces at the moment of their maximum expression. And the stem, with its rhythm of nodes and between nodes, with its constant mediation between the descending forces of the root and the ascending forces of the flower, corresponded to the rhythmic system of the human being, to the heart and lungs, to the element that mediated between the two poles and that sustained the fundamental rhythm of existence. Perceiving the cycle of the soul with the eyes that Steiner sought to awaken was perceiving in each phase of one's life something that went beyond the immediate subjective experience of comfort or discomfort, of abundance or scarcity of strength. It was to perceive in each phase the expression of a spiritual law that made that phase necessary, that had prepared the conditions for that phase to be possible, and that was, through that phase, preparing the conditions for what would come next. It was to perceive in each fall the seed of the next flowering, not as empty consolation, but as recognition of a law that careful observation confirmed again and again. And it was to perceive, in each rebirth, not only the relief of having overcome the fall, but the specific enrichment that the fall had made possible, the new quality that had emerged from the inner work that withdrawal had required. The soul that blooms, falls, is reborn, and calls it living is not describing just any life. It is describing the life of a spiritual being who participates, through each complete cycle, in a process of development that is simultaneously his most personal and intimate process, and the most cosmic and most impersonal process there is, the process through which the spiritual universe develops using human beings as its most precious and freest instruments, those who can consciously collaborate with the process rather than simply be carried along by it. And to call this living, when truly understood, is to recognize that living, in the deepest and most complete sense of the word, is exactly that. Participating, with increasing awareness and increasing freedom, in the eternal cycle that the soul travels towards, that which, through each flowering, each fall, and each rebirth, is always and patiently becoming.